I was standing in my driveway in Goodyear, Arizona, staring at a downspout that was about to turn my front walkway into a skating rink, when Paige Rodriguez walked up and told me I was in violation of Cedar Ridge Landing Association rules. I had moved to this older planned neighborhood 6 months ago because the commute to my building inspection jobs was easy and the price was right. What I did not know was that the HOA board had been locked in feuds for years, and the welcome committee chair treated every newcomer like a potential criminal. I am a building inspector, so I know the difference between code and nonsense. This was nonsense. The downspout extension was temporary. A white plastic elbow that kept meltwater from pooling on the concrete. Paige stood on the sidewalk with a clipboard, her gray hair pulled into a tight ponytail, wearing a teal-belted wool coat and a cream-knit beanie. She did not smile. She said the extension was an unapproved modification and I had 24 hours to remove it or face fines. I told her it was not permanent and it was preventing ice. She said ice was not her problem. My compliance was. Then she said something I would not forget. You think you are smart, but you are not smarter than the HOA. I felt my jaw tighten. I needed to keep peace with my neighbors because I was trying to build a life here, but the HOA was already turning people against me. Paige had set up a hotline for neighbors to report violations, and she controlled it. Every call went straight to her. I had heard rumors she used it to settle personal scores. Now I was on her list. I asked Paige why a temporary fix needed approval. She said every exterior change required written consent from the architectural committee. I pointed out that the CC&Rs allowed temporary winterization measures. She said I was misreading the rules. I said I had the document in my house and I could show her. She said she did not need to see it because she had been on the welcome committee for 8 years and she knew what was allowed. Then she turned and walked away. I stood there watching her go, the cold air stinging my face. I had a service technician coming at 3 to check my furnace before the next storm hit, and I could not afford to have them cancel because of HOA drama. But I also could not let this slide. I went inside and pulled up the association documents on my laptop. The winterization clause was clear. Temporary measures for weather protection did not require prior approval as long as they were removed within 30 days of installation. I took a screenshot and emailed it to the HOA management company with a polite explanation. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning I found a violation notice taped to my front door. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, and it stated I had damaged common property and owed $250 for curb repair. I walked outside and looked at the curb. There was no damage. The snowbanks left no other place to park, so my truck was against the curb like everyone else on the block. I took photos of the curb from every angle. Then I took photos of my neighbors' vehicles in the same position. I forwarded the photos to the management company and wrote that the claim was false. Within an hour, I got a call from Paige. She said the damage was not visible to an untrained eye, but the board had documentation from a licensed contractor. I asked to see the documentation. She said it was privileged. I said that was not how it worked. She said I was being difficult and the HOA had every right to assess fees. I told her I would contest the fee at the next board meeting. She laughed and said good luck. Then she hung up. I sat in my kitchen and replayed the conversation in my head. This was escalating fast. I needed help. I called my neighbor across the street, a guy named Eric, who had lived in Cedar Ridge Landing for 15 years. Eric was popular in the neighborhood, and he had served on the board before Paige took over the welcome committee. He told me Paige had a pattern. She would pick a new homeowner, find a violation, and then pile on fees until they either paid or sold. The board backed her because she brought in revenue and kept the community looking uniform. Eric said the management company was scared of her because she threatened to switch providers every year. He also said I was not the first person she had targeted with a bogus damage claim. He offered to come to the next meeting and speak on my behalf. I thanked him and felt a little less alone. But I still needed proof that the curb claim was false. I spent the afternoon calling contractors I knew from work. One of them agreed to come out and inspect the curb for free. He arrived the next day, looked at the curb for 5 minutes, and wrote a 1-page letter stating there was no damage and no recent repair work. I scanned the letter and emailed it to the management company and the board. I thought that would force them to drop the fee. Instead, Paige changed tactics. 2 days later, I came home from a job site and found a tow warning sticker on my truck windshield. It said my vehicle was parked in violation of fire lane regulations and would be towed within 24 hours if not moved. I looked around. There was no fire lane. The curb was not painted red. There were no signs. I walked down the block and saw that no other vehicle had a sticker, just mine. I called the tow company listed on the sticker. The dispatcher told me the HOA had requested the tow and they were scheduled to pick up my truck the next afternoon. I asked who at the HOA authorized it. She said she could not release that information. I asked if they had verified the fire lane claim. She said they did not verify, they just towed based on HOA requests. I hung up and called the management company. The office manager told me there was no fire lane on my street and the tow request was not in their system. She said she would contact the board and get back to me. She never did. That night, I set up my phone to record the street from my living room window. I wanted to see if the tow truck actually showed up. At 2 p.m. the next day, a flatbed rolled up and stopped in front of my house. The driver got out and started hooking up my truck. I ran outside and told him there was no fire lane and the tow was bogus. He shrugged and said he had a work order from the HOA. I asked to see it. He showed me a printed dispatch slip with Paige Rodriguez listed as the contact. I took a photo of the slip with my phone. Then I told him I was calling the police. He unhooked my truck and left. I stood in the driveway shaking with anger. Paige had requested the tow without legal authority. That was the trump card I needed. But I did not play it yet. I walked away on purpose, because I wanted her to follow and say more. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I marked it on my calendar and spent the week gathering evidence. I had the contractor letter, the photos of the undamaged curb, the tow dispatch slip with Paige's name, and the violation notice. I also had the recording I had made from my window showing the tow truck arriving and leaving. But I needed one more thing. I needed a recording of Paige herself admitting what she was doing. I got it 3 days before the meeting. She left a voicemail on my phone at 11 at night. Her voice was tight and angry. She said I was making a mistake by fighting the fees, that the board had ways of making life difficult for people who did not cooperate, and that I should think carefully about whether I wanted to stay in Cedar Ridge Landing. She said the HOA had removed homeowners before and they could do it again. Then she said, "You are not special, you are just loud." I saved the voicemail and made 3 backup copies. That was the evidence I needed. I called Eric and told him about the voicemail. He said I should forward it to the HOA attorney immediately. I did. I sent the voicemail, the tow dispatch slip, the contractor letter, and the photos in one email to the attorney with a subject line that said urgent review needed. I got a reply 2 hours later. The attorney said he was reviewing the matter and would be in touch. The next morning, I got a call from the management company. The office manager told me the curb fee had been dropped and the violation notice had been rescinded. She sounded nervous. I asked if Paige was still on the welcome committee. She said that was a board personnel matter and she could not comment. I thanked her and hung up. But I knew the fight was not over. Paige was not the type to back down quietly. On the morning of the board meeting, I woke up to find my gate access code had been deactivated. I drove to the neighborhood entrance and punched in my code. The gate stayed down. I tried again. Nothing. A line of cars formed behind me. I pulled to the side and called the management company. The office manager said she would look into it. I told her I needed to get to work and I needed access now. She said she would call me back. I sat in my truck watching the gate open for other residents. Then I saw Paige drive up in a golf cart with chains on the tires. She had been doing snow patrols in that thing all week, cruising the streets looking for violations. She pulled up beside my window and smiled. She said my access had been suspended pending resolution of outstanding fees. I told her the fees had been dropped. She said she had not been notified. I said that was her problem, not mine. She said I could wait for the office to reinstate my code, or I could leave and come back later. I felt my hands grip the steering wheel. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I said, "Paige, my access code was deactivated without notice, and you are refusing to let me in even though the management company confirmed the fees are dropped." She looked at the camera and her face went red. She said, "You are not allowed to record me." I said I was on public property and I could record whatever I wanted. She leaned closer and said, You think you are smart, but you are not smarter than the HOA. Then she turned the golf cart around and drove off. I kept recording until she was out of sight. That was the second time she had said that line. And now I had it on video. The management company called back 20 minutes later and said my code was active again. I drove through the gate and went to work. But I could not stop thinking about the recording. Paige had threatened me on camera at the gate, and she had repeated the same line she had used in the driveway. That was a pattern. I forwarded the video to the HOA attorney with a note that said this is retaliation and it is documented. I did not get a reply. That afternoon I got a text from Eric. He said the attorney had resigned and the board was in a panic. He said Paige had been asked to step down from the welcome committee, but she refused. He said the meeting that night was going to be a disaster. I told him I was ready. The meeting was held in the clubhouse at 7. The parking lot was half full when I arrived. I walked in and saw about 30 homeowners sitting in folding chairs facing a long table where the board sat. Paige was at one end of the table, her clipboard in front of her, her teal coat still on. The board president, a balding man in his 60s named Dennis, called the meeting to order. He read through the standard business quickly. Then he opened the floor for homeowner comments. I raised my hand. Dennis nodded at me. I stood up and introduced myself. I said I had moved to Cedar Ridge Landing 6 months ago, and I had been targeted with false fees, bogus violation notices, and an illegal tow attempt. I said I had documentation of everything. Paige interrupted and said I was lying. Dennis told her to let me finish. I continued. I said the welcome committee chair had left threatening voicemails and had deactivated my gate access in retaliation. I said I had recordings, and I was prepared to share them. The room went quiet. Dennis looked at Paige. She looked at me. Then Eric stood up. He said he had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years and he had watched Paige run off 4 families with the same tactics. He said it was time for the board to take responsibility. Another homeowner stood up and said the same thing had happened to her. Then another. Within 5 minutes, 6 people were on their feet sharing stories. Paige tried to speak, but Dennis cut her off. He said the board would review the complaints and take action. Paige slammed her clipboard on the table and said, "You are all making a huge mistake." Then she walked out. After the meeting, Eric pulled me aside and said I should file a police report. He said Paige had a history of pushing boundaries and someone needed to draw a line. I told him I would think about it. But I already knew what I was going to do. I was going to play the tow dispatch log at the next meeting and force the board to act. I did not have to wait long. 2 days later, the board called an emergency session to address the complaints. The notice said all homeowners were invited and the session would be recorded. I showed up early. The clubhouse was packed. Paige was not there. Dennis opened the session and said the board had retained a new attorney and was conducting an internal review. He said any homeowner with documentation should submit it to the management company by the end of the week. I raised my hand and said I had something to share now. Dennis hesitated, then nodded. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the speaker system in the room. I played the voicemail Paige had left. Her voice filled the clubhouse, tight and threatening, saying the HOA had ways of making life difficult and I should think about whether I wanted to stay. When it ended, the room was silent. Then I played the video from the gate, Paige on camera, red-faced, saying I was not smarter than the HOA. When that ended, I held up the tow dispatch slip. I said, "This is a tow company dispatch log that shows Paige Rodriguez requested the tow of my vehicle without legal authority." I said I had submitted all of this to the previous attorney and he had resigned the next day. I said the board needed to explain why Paige was still in a leadership position. Dennis looked at the other board members. One of them, a woman in her 50s, said they had asked Paige to resign and she had refused. She said they were exploring legal options. Eric stood up and said legal options were not good enough. He said Paige had committed fraud and harassment and the board needed to involve the police. The room erupted. People started shouting. Dennis banged his gavel and said the board would take the matter under advisement. I sat down. I had done what I came to do. The police got involved 3 days later. A detective called me and said the district attorney was reviewing the case. He asked me to send all my documentation. I sent everything. The voicemail, the gate video, the tow dispatch slip, the contractor letter, the photos. He called me back the next day and said they were opening an investigation into fraud and harassment. He said Paige had a prior complaint on file from another homeowner 2 years ago. He said the DA was taking it seriously. I asked what would happen next. He said they would interview witnesses and review HOA records. He said it could take weeks. I thanked him and hung up. I felt a weight lift. This was no longer just an HOA fight. It was a criminal case. Paige must have found out about the investigation because 2 days later I got a certified letter from her personal attorney. It said I had defamed her at the board meeting and she was considering a lawsuit. It said I had 1 week to retract my statements and issue a public apology or she would file. I called the detective and told him about the letter. He said it was an intimidation tactic and I should ignore it. He said the DA had enough evidence to move forward and Paige's threats would only make things worse for her. I forwarded the letter to Eric and he laughed. He said Paige was panicking. He said the board had finally voted to remove her from the welcome committee and she had been banned from using the golf cart for patrols. He said half the neighborhood was celebrating. I wanted to celebrate too, but I knew Paige was not done. She had one more move left. On a Saturday morning, I was clearing snow from my driveway when Paige walked up with 2 people I did not recognize. She said they were from the architectural committee and they were there to inspect my property for code violations. I asked if she had scheduled the inspection with the management company. She said she did not need to because the committee had authority to inspect at any time. I said that was not true, and she needed to leave. She said I was obstructing an official inspection and she would report it to the board. Then one of the committee members, a younger guy in a puffy jacket, started taking photos of my house. I told him to stop. He ignored me. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I said, Paige, you are trespassing and I am asking you to leave. She stepped closer and said, you are not special. You are just loud. That was the 3rd time. The line had become her signature threat. I kept recording. I said, you have said that to me 3 times now, and I have it all on tape. She looked at the camera and her face went pale. She turned to the committee members and said, let us go. They walked away. I stood in my driveway watching them leave, the phone still recording. I had everything I needed now. The detective called me the following Monday. He said the DA had filed charges. Paige Rodriguez was being charged with fraud, harassment, and abuse of authority. He said the HOA records showed she had forged board approval signatures on multiple tow requests over the past 2 years. He said my case was the one that broke it open because I had the dispatch log and the recordings. He said there would be a court date in 6 weeks. I asked if I needed to testify. He said probably. I told him I was ready. He said the DA appreciated my documentation. He said most HOA cases fell apart because people did not keep records. I thanked him and hung up. I felt like I could breathe again. The neighborhood changed after the charges were filed. People started saying hello when I walked to my mailbox. Eric threw a barbecue and invited half the block. The new welcome committee chair, a retired teacher named Linda, stopped by to apologize for what I had been through. She said the board was rewriting the rules to prevent abuse. She said they were also replacing the management company. I told her that was a good start. She said the golf cart with the chains had been retired. I laughed. That thing had become a symbol of Paige's reign, and now it was gone. The court date came in early spring. The snow had melted, and the downspout extension was long gone. I sat in the courtroom and watched Paige walk in with her attorney. She looked smaller than I remembered. The prosecutor laid out the case. The forged signatures, the bogus fees, the threatening voicemails, the illegal tow requests. Paige's attorney tried to argue she had been acting in good faith as a volunteer. The judge did not buy it. He said abuse of authority was a serious charge, and the evidence was overwhelming. Paige pled no contest. She was sentenced to probation, community service, and ordered to pay restitution to the 6 homeowners she had targeted. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order barring her from serving on any HOA board in the county. I walked out of the courtroom and Eric was waiting in the hallway. He shook my hand and said, "You did it." I said, "We did it." He smiled. The HOA board held a special meeting 2 weeks after the sentencing. Dennis stood up and read a formal apology on behalf of the association. He said the board took full responsibility for failing to oversee the welcome committee and allowing Paige to operate unchecked. He said they had implemented new oversight procedures and hired an independent compliance officer. He said any homeowner who had been charged bogus fees in the past 3 years could apply for a refund. I did not need a refund, but I appreciated the gesture. Eric was elected to the board that night. He said his first priority was transparency. He said the days of secret deals and personal vendettas were over. The room applauded. I believed him. I stayed in Cedar Ridge Landing. The neighborhood became what I had hoped it would be when I moved in. Quiet, friendly, normal. The new architectural committee approved my request to install a permanent gutter extension, and no one said a word. Linda started a neighborhood watch that actually focused on safety instead of nitpicking. The golf cart was donated to a local charity. I ran into Paige once, at a grocery store in town. She looked at me and walked the other way. I did not say anything. There was nothing left to say. The downspout that started it all is still there. Every time I walk past it, I think about how close I came to just giving up and paying the fees. I think about how many people do give up, because fighting an HOA feels impossible. But it is not impossible. You just need to keep records, stay calm, and know when to play your trump card. I played mine at the right time, and it changed everything. The district attorney told me later that my case had triggered a review of HOA practices across the county. 3 other boards were under investigation. I did not set out to be a whistleblower, but that is what happened, and I am okay with that. Eric and I became good friends. He told me stories about the old days of Cedar Ridge Landing before Paige took over. He said the neighborhood used to have block parties and holiday lights contests. He said people actually liked living here. He said we could get back to that. And we did. The first summer after the trial, the HOA hosted a community barbecue by the pool. 100 people showed up. Kids were running around, music was playing, and no one was checking clipboards. Linda gave a speech thanking everyone for their patience during the transition. She said the new board was committed to being a resource, not a police force. People cheered. I stood in the shade with a plate of food and watched the crowd. This was what an HOA was supposed to be. A group of neighbors working together to keep the place nice. Not a weapon, not a tool for revenge. Just a boring, functional organization that fixed the streetlights and paid the landscapers. I could live with that. The detective called me one more time, about a year after the sentencing. He said the DA had closed the investigation and thanked me for my cooperation. He said Paige had completed her community service and was staying out of trouble. He said the restraining order was still in effect and would be for 5 more years. He said I should not have any more problems. I thanked him and hung up. I believed him. I had moved on. The HOA had moved on. Paige had moved on. The whole thing felt like a bad dream that had finally ended. I learned a lot from the whole experience. I learned that HOAs can be dangerous when the wrong people get power. I learned that most people are good and they just want to live in peace. I learned that keeping records is the most important thing you can do when someone is trying to bully you. And I learned that standing up for yourself, even when it is hard and scary, is worth it. Because if I had just paid the fees and kept quiet, Paige would still be out there targeting new homeowners. She would still be forging signatures and making threatening calls. She would still be driving that golf cart around looking for her next victim. But she is not. Because I fought back. And because Eric and Linda and the other homeowners fought back with me. That is how you beat a tyrant. You document everything. You stay calm, and you make them answer for what they did. And then you move on and build something better. The last time I thought about Paige was during the next winter. I was shoveling my driveway and I saw the new welcome committee doing their rounds. Linda was with them, carrying a clipboard. But instead of hunting for violations, they were handing out flyers about the holiday lights contest. They stopped at my house and Linda asked if I was going to enter. I said maybe. She said the prize was a gift card to a local restaurant. I said I would think about it. She smiled and moved on. That was what a welcome committee was supposed to do. Welcome people, not terrorize them. I finished shoveling and went inside. My house was warm. The furnace was running fine. The downspout was doing its job. Everything was normal. and that was exactly what I wanted. I still live in Cedar Ridge Landing. I probably always will. It is home now. The board is stable. The fees are fair. The rules make sense. Eric is still on the board and he keeps things running smoothly. Linda retired from the welcome committee and they replaced her with a younger couple who actually like meeting new people. The neighborhood has grown. New families have moved in. Kids are everywhere. The pool is packed every summer. The clubhouse hosts movie nights and yoga classes. It is everything an HOA should be and nothing it should not be. And every time I walk past that downspout, I remember the day Paige tried to fine me for protecting my walkway from ice. I remember the tow truck. I remember the gate. I remember the voicemail. And I remember the moment I decided I was not going to let her win. That was the best decision I ever made. Because now I have a home, a real home, in a neighborhood that works. And Paige Rodriguez is just a bad memory that gets smaller every year.